Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about kind of a idea of the group of five playoff coming into the effect in college football, and I tend to be on the favor of that, but definitely a very, very interesting thing that will unfold. Anthony had a good question over here about the Big Ten and the SEC adding some of these bigger teams, and would they kick out some of these smaller teams in their conference if they see fit and kind of build up that even more? I think that is something that definitely could happen, but when you look at the bottom feeders in some of those conferences, say Vandy in the SEC, they bring in so much money on the other side of things, on the academic side and the revenue or the research side, excuse me. They bring in so much money on that side of things that I think the SEC would be more than fine to just give Vanderbilt their check, have them get beat every year, and just continue on about their business. And then I think in the Big Ten, you have Northwestern, but you also want that research money. So it's one of those things that obviously if you're looking at this from a football lens, then yes, Vandy and Northwestern and some other ones in those two conferences would likely get kicked to the curb for some of the bigger names that could come in, but there's so much more at play, and I think the research dollars that both of those universities have would keep them intact just long enough. So that would obviously be really interesting to watch, but I tend to believe that we're not necessarily staring that down in the face. We could be in a couple of years, but as of right now, I don't necessarily worry about that too much. But let's get into these 4-game stretches. We've been kind of unpacking this over the last couple of days. We got into the Big Four yesterday, the teams that are setting the pace going into this season with UGA, Ohio State, Texas, and Oregon. Now we got 4 other teams for you. And the team I want to start with is Alabama, one of the teams that is probably the most confusing going into this year, and for me it starts at South Carolina on October 12th, and that's kind of a weird starting point, and I understand that, but the reality is there is a lot of things that Alabama has kind of struggled with over the last little bit when you talk about some teams that have gotten under their skin, and a lot of it is when they go on the road, things get just a little bit sketchy for that team for whatever reason. That tends to be what happens, but this one is in your home stadium. You shouldn't necessarily have to worry too much, but when Lenora Sellers is on the other side of the field, you have to be worried at all times. This guy can make a play that can totally change the complexion of a game, and especially when he's throwing the ball to a guy like Nick Harbor, you have to be a little bit more on alert. So I'm not necessarily saying that Bama should have any trouble in this game, and frankly, if they do have a lot of trouble in this game, we might have to look at them a little bit side-eyed for the rest of the season, but it's definitely one that you just got to watch a little bit closer, at least for the first half, and then we'll see what happens from there. And then you get at Tennessee. It's obviously one that is going to have just so much juice. We talked about the Tennessee UGA game yesterday and how going into the season, it feels like it has more energy behind it than it really ever has before, because I think Tennessee is coming into this year thinking, we're not going to be a team that wins 10 games and then just kind of fades off into the abyss. We're not going to be a team that is afraid of the Bamas and the UGAs of the world. We're going to play them on our terms, and we have a chance to beat them. And I think the biggest thing here is you have Nick Saban's gone. The guy that was so scary, the guy that absolutely dominated you for so long, he's gone. And if you feel like you have this, new lease on life if you're Tennessee, and you have the ability to kind of flip this thing on its head. So it's going to be a huge game, and frankly, it's going to be one of those games that totally defines this first season for Kalen DeBoer in Alabama. So, and Anthony, absolutely, dual threat quarterbacks pose problems to pretty much every defense, but for whatever reason, Alabama has been a little bit more susceptible to that. We saw it last year with Jaden Daniels, and if you could get through that game, then it was going to be a problem for Alabama. I can almost promise you that. I don't know if LSU would win, but they definitely might have. But then you go on to Missouri on October 26th. This is a game that I think is going to be really, really interesting for a number of reasons, because I don't know what Missouri is going to be this year. I'm having just a remarkably hard time getting a good beat on Missouri this upcoming year, and I think when you get into games like this is a game where Missouri finally feels like they belong in it. I think there was a long time where Missouri was just scratching and clawing to fight for some of these games, to be, a South Carolina of the world, where maybe you're not going to win 10 games in that year, but you might cause some problems for some teams throughout the year. They now want to compete for a college football playoff. That's the way that they want to go about business, and this is the game where they can pretty much solidify that in a lot of ways. They can say, we're going to be a team that you're going to have to worry about going forward. This would be the best way to send that message. And then you go to LSU. This is always a show. There's no two ways about that. That's always the one that you always want to tune into, and frankly, I think it's one that LSU feels pretty good coming into this one, because although their defense is not great and their secondary is a little bit suspect, so is Alabama's, and you have to worry about that on the other side. And I think Garrett Nussmeier is going to be an absolute beast. We'll talk about that tomorrow, but he's someone that I think is going to absolutely light up offenses, and behind that offensive line, it's going to be hard for Bama to get home, and if they can't get home, it's going to be nearly impossible for them to keep up on the back end. So overall, I think when you look at this game, obviously it doesn't include the UGA game, which is the biggest game for Bama this upcoming year, but this is the stretch where they change, the complexion of their season. If you lose to UGA, then you likely have to go 3-1 in this stretch at the very least. But there's a reality where I see a 1-3 stretch here. I'm not necessarily saying that's what's going to happen. That probably wouldn't be my pick at the end of the day. But when you go to Tennessee, when you play a good Missouri team that has all the momentum in the world, and then you go to LSU, you're going to have trouble. You're going to have some issues at your hands, and maybe you come out of those with losses. So it'll be really interesting to watch that unfold. But then let's move on to Penn State. And I think it starts at USC for a number of reasons, but I think this one's just one of the weirdest games of the entire season. You have a Penn State team going all the way across the country to play a team that they've only really played in the postseason in the Rose Bowl, and it's one of those things that I think you're going to figure out, the real pecking order of this conference in games like this. Penn State, USC, USC, Wisconsin, Wisconsin, Iowa, all those teams right in the middle are going to give you an idea of who's the next up, who's the team that maybe it's not 2024, but 2025 can really make some noise. And Penn State absolutely can make noise in 2024, but they definitely need to set themselves up to say, USC is not going to walk in here and knock us off, or even Oregon is someone that they're going to try to box out as much as they can. But at the end of the day, it's going to be really interesting to see how that one rolls out and how that one kind of unfolds. But then they go to Wisconsin, and that one is very, very interesting for a number of reasons, because Ohio State is lurking right around the corner. And it's really, really hard this year to not be looking towards that Ohio State game the week before. So that Wisconsin game is one where maybe you don't see much in it right now. Maybe you don't see an upset coming there. But when you look around it and you see the big-time game coming up right after this one, you might just be a little bit worried if you're a Penn State fan. But then the Ohio State one is where Penn State can take that next step. It's where Penn State can prove that they are a different team than they have been the last couple of years. And they're not just going to just get absolutely dominated by the two big teams up top and then be able to beat everyone below them. They can compete with everyone in this conference. So it's a huge game for perception. They don't necessarily have to win it, but they got to play much better football than they did a year ago. That's for sure. And then you have Washington to kind of finish out this stretch. And frankly, I think this one they should really roll in. I think this is one that, yes, you will have a Washington team that has kind of gotten rolling over the last, couple of months. It's a little bit later in the season, but overall, if they do not win this one and keep it moving on to maybe a Big Ten championship or maybe even a playoff, they're going to have some problems on their hands. But let's move right along here to Notre Dame, and I think it starts with Louisville, and frankly, this stretch doesn't include the three biggest games on their schedule with A&M, Florida State, and USC, but these are the games that might just define if they get into the playoff, because the reality is this is not a hard schedule, but they could get tripped up by one of these games, and then it totally torpedoes their season. So Louisville is where it starts, and frankly, this is one that I think is the fourth most dangerous game on their schedule, and Jeff Brom is one of those guys that any given Saturday could play just elite football and play with pretty much anyone in the country. So it'll be really interesting. Obviously, we'll know so much more about this Louisville team once that game does come around, but I think this is the one, especially of this list, that is the most sketchy, and if they do lose it, then they definitely do have a problem on their hands. Stanford, frankly, is a layup. No disrespect to the Cardinal, but the reality is Notre Dame, if they don't walk in there and win by 10, 14, 21 points, they have a really big problem. And if they don't hold Stanford to 10, 14 points, they have a really big problem on their hands. And then you go to Georgia Tech. I think that's the one that I'm circling where this one could get sketchy. I'm not necessarily saying that Georgia Tech is going to outright beat Notre Dame, but Notre Dame is in this stretch of the season at this point where they feel a little bit momentum, especially if they've beaten that A&M team. They're going to be going into this with a lot of energy and a lot of juice, but the reality is it's going to be really interesting to see this kind of unfold, because this is not going to be a team that is going to hand you stuff. Georgia Tech is so good at spreading out defenses and making them be off kilter and making them be on their back foot that Notre Dame, although they have an incredible defense, they're not going to stop this team from scoring. They might be able to stifle them a little bit, but they're not going to outright stop this team from scoring. And if on the other side of the ball they have some trouble at wide receiver and quarterback and some of the issues that could pop up throughout the year, you might just have a game on your hands that totally ruins Notre Dame's season before they even really get going. So I think it's going to be really interesting. Anthony, I believe it is he's going into his second or third year as the full-time head coach. He went 9-3 or 9-4 in his very first year, but I don't know if he had the interim tag during that year. And then last year had a 10-win season, and so I believe it's his third year. I could be wrong. Navy, he brings up a great point, because the reality is Navy plays a game that no one else plays. At this very moment, Navy plays the style of triple option that Air Force and Army have gotten a little bit further away from. Navy is pretty much still a big-time option team. They definitely have spread it out a little bit more, but the reality is this is a game that obviously Notre Dame should walk in and absolutely dominate. If you're looking at this on paper, it's absolutely no problem, but if you want to go back and watch some of the triple option teams beat teams that are just far better than them, you're more than welcome to, because there are a number of examples from that Paul Johnson Georgia Tech era where they walked into a game against a Georgia team that was better at literally every single position and by a comfortable margin, and then they just outright beat them by getting on the edge, by making them confused with all of the different movements that they had. And the triple option is one that no one can defend. They can do their best to slow it down, they can do their best to stop it as best they can, but you're never going to fully stop it because there's too many variables to keep track of, especially with a quarterback that can run it really well. So I think it's going to be really interesting to watch, and one of those games that it's not necessarily overly, interesting. It's not necessarily one that you're circling, but it's one that could be trouble for Notre Dame. But let's get into Florida State here, and this is the most interesting stretch of the bunch to me, because Memphis starts this one on September 14th, and it's really early in the season, and I think it's one of those games where Memphis is a really good team. They're not just a good group of five team. They're a team that could absolutely play in the SMU role, be in that kind of ACC, and maybe make some noise in that conference this year. If they were in that conference, well, they at least get a shot at one of those teams in that conference, and it's the one that they want a shot at in Florida State. So I think this could be a moment where Memphis sees what's in front of them. They see a chance to have that, program-changing moment, and they take it. I think this is a very dangerous game for Florida State, and obviously them coming down to Tallahassee helps a ton, but at the end of the day, it's going to be so interesting to watch this game unfold. And then you have Cal. This is one that frankly is the easiest of the bunch here by a pretty comfortable margin. The one variable here is Jay Knott is on the other side of the field, and whenever he is someone that can win a game by himself. So that's obviously the big-time worry for this team. And then you get into an at SMU game that, frankly, I think is so interesting. I think this is one of those games that could totally ruin the what Florida State wants to do this year and totally flip the entire ACC on its head, because they got to go all the way out to Dallas to play a game. I get they go all the way up to Syracuse and they do that type of thing, but this is a totally different game. SMU sold this thing out yesterday, so they are plenty prepared for this game, and they absolutely want to come into this conference with a bang, and this would absolutely be the way to do it. So I think this is the game where if you were to circle one on Florida State's schedule where you say that one could be the place that their entire season kind of gets blown up, that would be the one that I would circle. And then you got Clemson right around the corner, which is another reason why that SMU game is so sketchy, because like the last 3 years, this is going to define their season. One way or the other, if they win or they lose, this is going to be the game that they look back on and say, that was the difference maker of us making the ACC title, making the playoff, what have you. But at the end of the day, I can't get a beat on any of these teams. Either of these teams are so hard to figure out how good they're going to be, where they're going to be good. I know Florida State's going to have a good defense. I know Clemson's going to have a good defense. I have about a million questions on the offensive side of the ball for both teams. So I don't really know how that game's going to go, frankly. I think this is the stretch where we're going to find out, is Florida State the team that we expect them to be after a fantastic 2023, or is DJ and some of these transfers that they brought in just not enough to get them where they wanted to go this upcoming year? And we'll really figure out in that SMU and Clemson game, because both of those are ones that they could absolutely lose if they're not careful. But Let's take our final break here. When we come back, we're going to get into hot takes around some of the contenders in the Big Ten. A ton to break down in those. So we'll go ahead and take our break and be right back with that.